There's a letter I found in a Victorian archive, written in 1879 by a woman named Margaret to her younger sister, who had just announced her engagement. And in this letter, Margaret wrote something that stopped me cold. She wrote, "My dearest sister, I am happy for your news. But before you bind yourself to this man for life, I must ask you 3 questions. Has he ever made you wait without explanation? Has he ever dismissed your concerns as hysteria? And does he treat servants with contempt when he thinks no one of importance is watching?" And then she wrote, "If the answer to any of these is yes, burn his letters and run." 3 questions, 3 tests. And according to Margaret, they predicted everything. Because here's what nobody tells you about Victorian women. We think of them as naive, sheltered, trusting to a fault. But the smart ones, the ones who survived that brutal social landscape with their dignity and safety intact, they were the most suspicious, calculating, psychologically astute people you can imagine. They had to be. Because in their world, trust was currency. And the wrong investment could cost you everything. Let me paint you a picture. You're a woman in Victorian England. You've just been introduced to someone new. Maybe a potential suitor. Maybe a new friend in your social circle. Maybe a business associate of your husband's who needs a favor. And here's your reality. You have almost no legal rights. If you're unmarried, your reputation is your only asset. One whispered rumor, one betrayal, and your prospects vanish. If you're married, your husband controls everything. Your money, your property, even your children. If he turns out to be cruel or irresponsible, you have almost no recourse. So the question becomes, how do you know who to trust? How do you spot the predators before they strike? How do you identify the users, the manipulators, the people who will smile to your face and destroy you behind your back? Victorian women developed a system, an elaborate, psychological framework for evaluating character before extending trust. And it was brilliant. Dark, sometimes cruel, but brilliant. They called it observation before intimacy. And it worked like this. When you met someone new, you didn't trust them. Not immediately. Not just because they seemed nice or came with good references or belonged to the right family. Instead, you watched them. Carefully. Methodically. Looking for specific signs. And the first thing you watched for, how they treated people who couldn't help them. There's a diary entry from a woman named Caroline, dated 1862. She's describing a man who was courting her. Wealthy family. Impeccable manners. Everyone approved of him. But she wrote, "Today we passed a beggar on the street. My suitor kicked the man's cup as we walked by. Not obviously. Just enough to spill the coins. And when I looked at his face, he was smiling." She broke off the courtship that week. Her family was furious. They called her foolish, hysterical, throwing away a good match over nothing. 2 years later, that man was arrested for embezzling from his business partners. Eventually fled the country to avoid prosecution. Caroline's diary entry about it simply says, "A man who enjoys causing pain to the powerless will eventually cause pain to everyone." That was the first Victorian test. How does this person treat those who have no power over them? Servants, children, animals, the poor, the sick. Because Victorian women understood something that modern psychology has since confirmed. Cruelty trickles up. Someone who is casually cruel to the vulnerable is simply waiting for the opportunity to be cruel to you. But they didn't stop there. The second test was more subtle, more psychological. They tested for something they called steadiness of character. And the way they tested it was fascinating. They would make small requests, nothing major, but specific. "Could you send me that book you mentioned? Could you meet me at 3 instead of 4? Could you keep this confidence?" And then they would wait, not just to see if the person followed through, but to see how they followed through. Did they do it immediately or did they need reminding? Did they make excuses? Did they turn a small favor into a big dramatic production where you ended up feeling like you owed them? There's a letter from a Victorian etiquette advisor to young ladies that explains this perfectly. She writes, "A person of true character performs small kindnesses as naturally as breathing. They do not announce them, do not expect praise, do not keep score. But a person of false character treats every minor favor as evidence of their exceptional virtue, which you must now repay with gratitude and obligation. That's the test. Not whether someone will do you a favor, but whether they weaponize the favor afterward. I found a heartbreaking example of this in a set of letters between two Victorian women. Friends, or so they thought. One woman, Elizabeth, had confided something personal to the other, Margaret. Nothing scandalous, just vulnerable. A fear she had. An insecurity. And for months everything seemed fine. They continued their friendship. But Elizabeth noticed something. Every time there was a disagreement, every time Elizabeth expressed an opinion Margaret didn't like, Margaret would make a small comment. Well, given your struggles with confidence, considering what you told me about your fears. She was using Elizabeth's vulnerability as a weapon. Early. Just enough to remind Elizabeth that Margaret held power over her. Elizabeth's diary entry about ending the friendship is brutal in its clarity. She writes, "I have learned that a true friend guards your secrets as treasure. A false friend hoards them as ammunition." That was the second test. Do they keep your confidences sacred? Or do they collect your weaknesses like tools? But here's where the Victorian system gets really dark, really psychological, because the third test was the most revealing of all. They tested for envy. Victorian women understood that envy was the most dangerous emotion in their social ecosystem. More dangerous than anger. More destructive than greed. Because envy wears the mask of friendship. Envy smiles while it sabotages. So they would watch. When something good happened to you, how did this person react? Not their words. Words are cheap. But their micro-expressions. The flash in their eyes. The tightness in their smile. The speed with which they changed the subject or found a way to diminish your joy. There's a fascinating passage in a Victorian novel, written by a woman named Mary Elizabeth Braddon. One character describes another. "She congratulated me on my engagement with such enthusiasm that I immediately knew she wished me ill. For genuine happiness for another's fortune is quiet and warm, while false happiness is loud and cold." Loud and cold. That phrase stuck with me. Because it's so accurate, isn't it? Performative excitement. Over-the-top reactions that feel somehow hollow. Victorian women were trained from childhood to spot this. To understand that the friend who made too big a show of celebrating your success was often the friend who would quietly work to undermine it. I found a letter from a mother to her daughter that outlined this explicitly. The mother wrote, "Beware the woman who praises your beauty too effusively, for she is measuring herself against you and finding herself wanting. Beware the woman who celebrates your engagement too loudly, for she is already calculating how to explain your happiness as luck rather than merit. True friends are glad for your joy. False friends are performing gladness while nursing resentment." That was the third test. The envy test. And Victorian women applied it ruthlessly. But here's what I find most interesting. These tests weren't about paranoia. They weren't about never trusting anyone. They were about protecting yourself long enough to see people's true character. Because the Victorian women who wrote about this, who passed these lessons down to their daughters, they weren't cynical. They were strategic. They understood that trust was precious. That it should be earned slowly. That intimacy without observation was dangerous. There's a diary from a woman named Helena, a Victorian governess who never married but had dozens of close friendships throughout her long life. And in her later years, she wrote about her philosophy of friendship. She said, "I have learned to love carefully, not less deeply but more slowly. I watch how people move through the world before I let them move through my life. And because of this care, I have never been betrayed. My friendships are few, but they are fortresses. Few but fortresses." That was the Victorian ideal. And I think about that a lot. Because we live in such a different world now. We're encouraged to be open, vulnerable, to trust quickly and forgive easily. We match with strangers on apps and share our life stories over coffee. We trauma bond with co-workers we barely know. We mistake intensity for intimacy. And sometimes that works out beautifully. Sometimes that openness leads to genuine connection. But sometimes we give our trust to people who haven't earned it. And we end up blindsided, wondering how we missed the signs. What if we borrowed from the Victorian playbook? Not the oppressive parts, not the rigid social hierarchies, but the parts about observation, about taking your time, about testing character before granting intimacy. What if, before you trusted someone with your vulnerabilities, you watched how they treated the waiter, the Uber driver, the person who couldn't do anything for them? What if, before you let someone deep into your life, you noticed whether they kept their small promises, whether they showed up on time, whether they remembered what you told them mattered to you? What if you paid attention to how people reacted to your good news? Not just their words but their energy, the warmth or coldness behind the congratulations. These aren't Victorian tests anymore. They're just wisdom, pattern recognition, self-preservation. There's a concept in modern psychology called thin slicing. It's the idea that we can make surprisingly accurate judgments about people based on very brief observations, if we know what to look for. And research shows that some of the best predictors of someone's character are exactly what Victorian women were watching for. How someone treats service workers predicts how they'll treat you once the honeymoon phase ends. Whether someone keeps small promises predicts whether they'll keep big ones. How someone reacts to your success predicts whether they'll support or sabotage you. The Victorians didn't have psychological studies, but they had centuries of observation, of women comparing notes, of mothers warning daughters, of hard lessons learned and passed down. And what they figured out was this: character reveals itself in the margins, in the moments people think don't matter, in how they behave when they believe no one important is watching. A Victorian lady wouldn't trust you just because you were charming at dinner parties. She'd wait to see how you behaved when the party was over, when you were tired, when you thought the performance was done. She'd watch you over time, in different contexts, under different pressures, and only after you'd proven yourself consistent, kind to the vulnerable, reliable in small things, and genuinely happy for others' joy. Only then would she consider you worthy of her trust. And if you failed those tests, she wouldn't make a scene, wouldn't confront you, wouldn't give you the satisfaction of knowing you'd been evaluated and found wanting. She would simply maintain distance, polite but cool, friendly but never intimate. There's a perfect example of this in the letters of Queen Victoria herself. She wrote about a lady-in-waiting who had disappointed her, not through any major scandal, just through a pattern of small betrayals, gossip shared, confidences broken, cattiness disguised as concern. Victoria never fired her, never addressed it directly, but her letters show how she systematically withdrew trust. Shorter conversations, fewer private audiences, important matters discussed with other advisors instead. And in a letter to her daughter, Victoria explained her reasoning. I do not waste energy on confrontation with those who prove unworthy of intimacy. I simply relocate them from the inner circle to the outer sphere. They may remain in my court, but not in my confidence. That's cold. But it's also smart. Because the Victorian women understood that not everyone deserves an explanation for why they're being held at arm's length. Sometimes people prove through their actions that they can't be trusted with closeness. And the wise response isn't drama, it's distance. So what would a Victorian lady tell you today, before you trusted someone? What would her warning be? I think she'd say this: watch them before you trust them. Not for perfection. Nobody's perfect. But for patterns. Watch how they treat those who can't help them. Watch whether they keep their word in small things. Watch how they react when you shine. And if what you see troubles you, trust that trouble. Your instincts are Victorian-era technology, refined over generations of women learning to read danger. Don't ignore them in the name of being nice. She'd tell you that trust should be earned slowly and lost quickly. That intimacy without observation is reckless. That you don't owe anyone access to your inner world just because they want it or expect it. She'd remind you that you are not required to give people the benefit of the doubt when their actions have already shown you who they are. That giving someone a chance often just means giving them another opportunity to hurt you. And she'd say what Margaret said to her sister in that letter from 1879. Better to be alone than in bad company. Better to be cautious than betrayed. Better to be called suspicious than to be called a fool. The Victorian women knew something we've forgotten in our rush to be open and authentic and trusting. They knew that your inner circle is sacred. That not everyone deserves a key to your heart. That it's okay, necessary even, to make people prove themselves before you let them in. They knew that the person you should protect most carefully is yourself. And that starts with being selective about who you trust. So watch. Test their character in small ways before betting your happiness on big ones. And if they fail those tests, if they're cruel to the powerless, unreliable in small things, or resentful of your joy, run. Just like Margaret told her sister. Burn the letters and run. Because a Victorian lady would rather stand alone in integrity than kneel in false connection. And maybe that's a warning worth heeding.